on this very, very interesting conference, especially to you, Azriel. And it's my pleasure to open this panel. It's designed to deal with the missile defense on the global level. It's more important. And I believe that the name of this panel is the best description of existing reality in Europe or among the powers, because it becomes a significant component of the NATO-Russia competition. Russian concern is that the United States BMD shield in Europe would weaken its nuclear deterrence system and create a threat to its national security. And as an attempt to ease the Russian concern, the US changed its BMD plan several times, but Russians continue to insist that it's not enough, especially after the nuclear deal with Iran. So here we are with a lot of question marks, looking for explanations for our participants of this panel, and I'm honored to introduce them. The first, our speaker will be Dr. Azriel Bermant, a research fellow of the INSS, our institute. Dr. Bermant has his PhD from University College of London. Between 1998 and 2006, he worked as an expert for the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Jerusalem. He specialized in United States armed control policy, US policy on the Middle East, NATO missile defense policy, and nuclear weapons proliferation. And he will present for us the topic, his name is What Will an Iran Deal Mean for NATO-Russia Relations. So, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. The issue of missile defense, NATO missile defense, has become taken an interesting twist with the interim deal, with the P5+1 deal with Iran over its nuclear program. The question is whether this agreement means that there is no longer a need for a NATO missile defense system in Europe. This is something that I'm going to be discussing. First of all, I'm going to do a brief introduction on the Obama administration's missile defense initiative, the European phased adaptive approach. This is something that Ambassador Vershbow discussed this morning, but for those who weren't there, I'll just briefly outline it. And then I want to talk about the threat from Iran, because the NATO missile defense program was established. The Obama initiative was established with the Iranian threat in mind, although NATO has been very careful not to say that it's directed at Iran, but that is the main reason for the EPAA. I also want to discuss the tensions that have arisen between NATO and Russia over missile defense. Before getting to the argument over whether a deal with Iran would actually change anything, and a brief discussion also of the NATO-Russia possibility of a cooperation between NATO and Russia. Now, the NATO-European phased adaptive approach was unveiled by the Obama administration on the 17th of September 2009, and the main goal is to provide a more comprehensive, flexible, cost-effective response to the threat of long-range ballistic missiles. Washington particularly wanted to strengthen its commitment to the protection of its NATO allies, while at the same time providing protection for the US homeland. And the EPAA was designed to do this. The first phase of this program was to deploy ships, Aegis ships in the Mediterranean, and radars. A second phase in 2015 involves the deployment of more advanced interceptors in Romania to counter missile threats. The third phase in 2018 is perhaps the more controversial, because this involves the deployment of more advanced interceptors that some Russians have claimed, not just Russians, some other experts have claimed could possibly pose a threat to the Russian nuclear deterrent. The fourth phase, which was announced, involved the deployment of interceptors to deal with more longer-range missiles. And this is more to protect the United States from the missile threat. This was later cancelled. Why was it cancelled? It appears not to please the Russians. More to the point, there were some budgetary problems and also difficulties with the technology. So the decision was made to cancel it. Now, the idea behind the NATO missile defense system, the EPAA, is to link the security of the United States to that of the West, while providing very strong security guarantees to Eastern European countries, not just Eastern Europe, but particularly against the threat from Iran. The NATO summit in Lisbon in November 2010 stressed that missile defense was an important component of the NATO strategy. There was also a reference to the fact that NATO missile defense was designed to provide protection to NATO populations, to NATO territory, and also to forces inside Europe. But there was one further element, which was that there was an offer to start establishing cooperation with the Russians on missile defense, to integrate missile defense assets with the Russians. This is something I'll discuss later on, but the fact is cooperation on missile defense has not really taken off, and there are suggestions, many experts believe that they will never really take off. At the same time, there are many that argue that this is a huge missed opportunity, that in spite of all the difficulties between NATO and Russia, the threat from countries such as Iran is such that there ought to be greater cooperation to deal with this problem. So we'll come to that later. Now, the threat from Iran, let's just briefly look at it. Some of my colleagues have discussed it earlier, but in a nutshell, as I said, the main reason for the missile defense system, NATO missile defense system is Iran, even though NATO hasn't talked about it openly, but US officials have been more open on the fact that this is the main threat. In a scenario of NATO support for a US or Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, Tehran could, at least theoretically, launch a retaliatory missile strike on Europe. And this is a concern. Iran already has, for example, the Shahab-3 missile, which can reach a range of 2,000 kilometers. It has operational missiles with ranges of 1,500 to 2,500 kilometers, which can reach targets in the Middle East, Turkey, and Southeast Europe. There are reports, for example, that it has BM-25 ballistic missiles with a range of 3,000 kilometers, which could reach Central Europe. One other issue is the fact that it has a space launch vehicle program, which could give it provide an added contribution to its ability to carry out long-range missile attacks. Now, the tensions between NATO and Russia over missile defense, there are a number of elements here. The claim by Russia, even before the Obama administration, well before, was that missile defense in Europe was a threat to its nuclear deterrent. And by the way, as some of my colleagues said previously, it's not just the US missile defense programs in Europe. It's also US missile defense programs in other parts of the world, such as in East Asia. Russia also has difficulties over this, and China has difficulties with the United States over missile defense in Asia. So it's not just in Europe, but I will focus now on the NATO, because that's where perhaps the tensions with Russia are greatest. Of course, there is the argument that there is an inconsistency in the US position over Iran, because after all, if they're investing so much effort to reach an agreement with the Iranians, then why do they need this very expensive missile defense system? I mean, if there's all these efforts, if the US is saying publicly that we can reach a deal with Iran, then why do you need this costly, divisive missile defense system? In the meantime, Russia is making all sorts of threats regarding the system. For example, there's been the threat that it's going to withdraw from the New START agreement with the United States. There are also reports that Moscow is deploying short-range missiles in Kaliningrad, although there are doubts over the veracity of these reports. But of course, Moscow doesn't actually have to deploy these missiles. It only has to threaten to do it. And every report just helps the Russian the intimidation on this. But one other issue here is the fact that Russia has consistently dismissed Washington's reassurances that its missile defense system is designed to counter the threat from Iran. But from the point of view of the United States, there's an added value because these missile defense assets in countries such as Poland, Romania, they require the presence of US boots on the ground. So from the US point of view, it strengthens its military commitment to key countries in Central Europe. It strengthens its credibility. But from Russia's point of view, it just reawakens irritation, more than irritation, major anger and hurt over the fact that NATO's expanded eastwards, even though from the outset Russia was opposed to this and unhappy about it. So there are a lot of elements here, but I would say that some of the Moscow's anger over the missile defense issue is also perhaps related to the legacy of NATO's expansion eastwards. Vladimir Putin, back in February 2007, this was during the Bush era, not the Obama era, when the Bush administration had established negotiations with the Czechs and the Poles over a missile defense system. He said, our military specialists do not think that these systems are aimed at countering threats from Iran. He says that the time comes we will deal with this threat. He says, we think these arguments do not carry much weight. This does directly concern us, of course, and it would lead to an appropriate response. Robert Gates countered, they know perfectly well that the ballistic missile defense system that we're contemplating and proceeding to negotiate in Europe is no threat to Russia. And this cartoon from The Economist is a very good expression, I would say, of the dialogue of the deaf over this issue. Now, the problem with Russia's position, and Ambassador Vershbow mentioned this morning, he mentioned that not just Western experts, Russian experts have provided some clear, very strong arguments to show that interceptors in Europe would not be able to catch Russian missiles. So there's no basis for Moscow's objections over this. The other thing is that Moscow has underplayed legitimate concerns over the potential Iranian threat. And my colleague, Dr. Sachugin, will later on possibly discuss how Russia perceives the threat from Iran. Perhaps there's a contradiction between Russia's public rhetoric on Iran, and what it really feels deep, what really is going on under the surface. But now we come to the November deal, P5 deal with Iran. So does this create a new situation? Well, according to the Russians, it does. I mean, Foreign Minister Lavrov said that if Iran were to comply fully with all the provisions of the interim deal, there is no reason for the continued existence of the NATO missile defense system. And one other point which one can mention is that the NATO Lisbon Summit of 2010 stated that NATO missile defense would be developed in accordance with the level of threat. Well, if the threat recedes, is there a justification for a very expensive missile defense system which leads to greater tensions? The former German Foreign Minister, Gabriel Westerwelle, said that if the progress is made in negotiations with the Iranians, this could affect the future of the NATO missile defense system. Should NATO wait? Should NATO then wait for the outcome of negotiations with Iran before going forward with this? This is an argument which we are beginning to hear. So the Obama administration has responded very robustly. John Kerry, for example, has made it clear that future missile defense deployments will take place as planned. There's also another argument, and this is also something which Ambassador Vershbow said this morning, that Iran is not just about the nuclear threat, it's also about other forms of weapons of mass destruction. Iran can equip its missiles with chemical weapons, biological weapons, and also conventional weapons. Of course, the problem with that is, would it make sense to spend so much vast sums of money on missile defense to counter conventional threats? This is especially in view of the rise in tensions between Russia and NATO on the issue. One other point worth making is that it's not just about Iran, says the United States. Madeleine Creedon, an assistant State Department official, for example, says it's not just about Iran. Where are other countries going? There are other threats in the Middle East. She didn't necessarily specify, but I might add, for example, that Pakistan is probably at the back of some people's minds. I mean, if the government collapses, if extremists take control, this is the threat which one has to bear in mind. So it looks that in spite, first of all, even if a deal with Iran is reached, Iran's nuclear infrastructure would have to be taken apart completely before countries such as Romania, Bulgaria could feel safe. And I personally think there's not much chance of there being such an agreement. I don't see an agreement that would dismantle Iran's nuclear infrastructure. What could happen, and this is reasonably there's a reasonable possibility of this, is that Iran could sign an agreement which at least provides a temporary respite, but it could quickly break out to obtain a nuclear capability if it chooses to do so. It could well be that the Bermant administration's its main goal is simply to distance Iran from the bomb, but this leaves the problem in the hands of its successor. Now, one additional point is that Eastern European countries would be opposed to concessions on missile defense. Poland, for example, would be very concerned if the United States was to announce that its deployment in 2018 wasn't going to take place. Poland wants US personnel on its territory to operate these missile defense assets. And this is all about the US guarantees to countries, former Eastern Bloc countries. The United States, for its part, wants to strengthen its credibility among its European allies, including countries such as Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states. So it would be very problematic for the United States to start withdrawing its missile defense commitments at this point. Now, I do briefly, although it has been discussed Paul Schulte, for example, mentioned in passing and discussed the idea of NATO-Russia cooperation, particularly the Russian demand for guarantees from the Obama administration. But in fact, there's a lot of literature on the issue of cooperation between NATO and Russia, and a lot of experts, very serious experts, who argue that it is in the interests of NATO and Russia to establish cooperation, and that this can be done. For example, pooling information and relaying data from satellites. The problem, as Paul Schulte said, that is the Russians are demanding that the US provide legal guarantees that its missile defense will not be directed against Russia, and the Obama administration is simply not able to do this. But some experts, for example, at the IISS, Mark Fitzpatrick is among those, for example, who say that the failure of the United States and Russia to develop missile defense cooperation could be viewed as a very significant missed opportunity, because the threat from rogue regimes is the threat that should bring cooperation. But it looks unlikely that this will happen, because there isn't the political and military policies of both the West and Russia do not meet those standards which we need for the development of trust, which is absolutely essential for the joint development of missile defense systems. Of course, the United States, within the Republican Party, for example, there'd be many who would be very upset with such cooperation. They would see this as appeasement. And in the current climate, as things stand at the moment, it seems that such cooperation is unlikely. So, in conclusion, while the Obama administration wants a deal which will distance Tehran from the bomb, it seems to me that unless the nuclear program is dismantled and unless the weaponization issue is addressed, such an agreement may have only a limited, will have a temporary impact. So the threat, in other words, the threat will remain. At the same time, the concerns in countries such as Poland and the Baltic states over Russian intentions, and this would also mean that the United States, that there wouldn't, I just don't see in these circumstances, likelihood of a change to the current planned missile defense deployments, which will take place in 2015 and 2018. Indeed, I believe that changes to these deployments would be very politically sensitive and would send the wrong signal to US allies. So it would be unwise for the United States to start scaling back its missile defense commitments in Europe. And even if an agreement is reached with Iran, I believe that it is unlikely to lead to positive changes in the NATO-Russia relationship. I believe that the tensions will remain for some time to come. Thank you very much.